This story happened to a family from my church. To protect the privacy of everyone involved, their names have been changed for this video. There was a young couple by the name of Henry and Ava who had been married for about a year. They decided that they wanted to try to have a child. Ava had dreamed of being a mother her entire life, and she felt like it was one last puzzle piece that was missing from her life. She had finished nursing school and had her dream job at the local hospital. She had the beautiful wedding she had always dreamed of with her family and friends. Finally, she and Henry, who had been dating since high school, had just bought their first home. She had everything she wanted, except for children. She and Henry wanted a big family, a house full of lots of laughter and love. They were completely hopeful when they began trying for a baby. But as the months went on, Ava took pregnancy test after pregnancy test, only to test negative again and again. With each negative test, she became more and more worried. Was something wrong with her? Why couldn't she get pregnant? After 6 months had passed, Ava and Henry went to a fertility specialist to find out what more they could do to increase their chances of having a baby. When they were there, they both underwent several screenings and exams. When the tests came back, the couple was called back into the office to talk about the results. It was the news that they had feared the most. Due to certain health problems, Ava was not going to be able to have a baby. Even if they turned to IVF treatments, which would cost a fortune, it would still be extremely unlikely for them to conceive. There was nothing they could do. The couple was completely devastated, and for months, all they could do was try to process that the life that they thought they were going to have wasn't going to happen. Eventually, one of Ava's friends from church approached her and asked if she and Henry had ever considered adoption. This particular friend had 3 kids of their own, and after reading about a particular adoption program that worked with orphan children in Nigeria, they felt inspired to adopt a little girl. The couple said that it was the best decision they had ever made. It took Ava and Henry some time to get used to the idea. After all, they had always expected that they would be having their own children. But the more they talked about it and the more they learned, and they realized that this was something they really wanted. They knew that they could adopt a child in need and love it as much as they would love their own. Slowly, they made their way through the adoption process, coming across plenty of obstacles along the way. The program Ava's friend had used to adopt didn't currently have any children that weren't already in the midst of being adopted, so they had to look elsewhere. Eventually, they found a program that worked with a Haitian organization. There was a little girl named Esther, who was 4 years old and who had recently been moved into a home for orphans. The man that dropped her off said that he had known the girl's parents. He claimed that both of them died, leaving her all alone, barely scraping together enough food to survive. Ava and Henry were immediately touched by her story, and when they saw her photos and learned more about her, they fell in love with her right away. They continued with the adoption process, desperate to bring Esther home into their family. They soon learned that there would be over a $10,000 adoption fee if they wanted to move forward. This would mean that they would have to spend nearly all of their savings and even take on second jobs to pay for it. But they didn't care. They did it anyway. No price was too big to bring Esther home. After a very long process, Ava and Henry were eventually given the green light to travel to Haiti, where they met Esther and were allowed to bring her home. They bonded with the little girl instantly and were so happy when they got to take her home. Even though life in the United States was completely different than anything Esther had experienced in her entire life, she seemed to adjust quicker than everyone was expecting. Instead of being scared of things she'd never seen before, like kinds of technology, fast-moving cars, and music blasting from speakers, she seemed to be excited to learn more about them. One of the biggest challenges Esther faced was that she spoke no English when she arrived at the couple's home in the United States. She couldn't communicate with anyone, not even her new parents. She cried often, and Ava and Henry felt devastated that they couldn't console her. Frustrated that she couldn't express herself, The little girl would throw heartbreaking tantrums where she would throw things and break her toys. She would even purposefully hurt herself, as in a way to let out her anger. Ava and Henry were at a loss. They felt like they were failing their daughter. The pair worked daily with her to improve her language every second they got, and in time, things slowly got better. Ava stayed home full-time with her and made up her own lesson plans to help teach her English. Esther was extremely bright, and she made incredible progress. By the time she was 5, she began to be able to communicate in broken sentences. She spoke enough English to get her into preschool that year. Counselors had told the couple that getting her into school as soon as possible was important, so that she could learn how to communicate and interact with other little kids her age. Even though Ava and Henry were terrified that their new daughter would be bullied in school because she had grown up very differently than the other kids, she did surprisingly well and had no problems making friends. As Esther grew and progressed academically, she began to share what her life was like before she had been adopted. This all started when she started kindergarten and was asked to draw a picture of her family. She drew a picture of her mother, herself, and 3 other small children. It was clear as soon as she brought the picture home that her new adoptive parents were nowhere in her picture. Because of how hard they had been trying to make her feel like a part of their family, this was painful to see. The couple gently asked Esther about her old life. The little girl slowly opened up, and her story was enough to break anyone's heart. She talked about the poor village she was from and the tiny shack her family of 6 called home. She and her family slept on thin mats on the ground, and at night they were often tormented by insects that bit and stung their skin. She talked very fondly about her mom, explaining how her mom did everything she possibly could for her family, even going days without food so that her children could eat. Even still, there were many nights that Esther had gone to bed with her belly grumbling. With tears running down her face, the little girl described how her baby sister Nadia would scream and cry at night because she was starving. Esther began to hide her own food so that she could give it to her baby sister. Meanwhile, she survived on nothing but roots and tree bark, her stomach aching day after day. All of this information was absolutely heartbreaking to Henry and Ava. But they couldn't help but notice that one person was noticeably missing from all of Esther's stories. She never once mentioned a father. When they eventually brought this up to her, tears formed in Esther's eyes and a strange expression crossed over her face. It was almost like the mention of the word father was enough to traumatize her and bring back terrible memories. Esther explained that things had gotten particularly bad in her village a couple of years ago. Due to sickness, it was hard for her family to get basic necessities they needed to survive. Her father was her worst nightmare. He was a cruel and selfish man who thought only of himself and not of his family. He often abused Esther's siblings and mother. Esther did everything she could think of to protect her siblings, even putting herself in between them and her angry, violent father at the time. At this point in the story, Esther was sobbing so hard she could barely speak, and she ran out of the room. Ava and Henry decided they would not bring up Esther's father again unless she wanted to talk about him. While they were tucking her into bed a few days later, the little girl suddenly began telling them the horrific ending of her story. Her brow furrowed in concentration, as if she was determined not to cry. She explained that in order to save the rest of the family, her father sacrificed her and decided to sell her into a local human trafficking ring. The last memory she had of her family was her mother sobbing as her father ripped her from her mother's arms and passed her off to other bad men who hurt her in some of the most horrific ways imaginable. One of the bad men had felt sorry for Esther, and while the rest of the group was sleeping, he slipped away with her and brought her to the shelter in hopes that she would at least have a chance at a better life. When he arrived with her at the shelter home, nobody asked him any questions. As soon as he dropped her off, he quickly disappeared off into the night. Ava and Henry were completely heartbroken and devastated. As much as the couple loved their daughter and couldn't imagine losing her, they knew they had to put her happiness before their own. It was time to help their little girl reunite with her family. The couple worked with the adoption center to eventually track down Esther's family. They traveled with Esther back to Haiti and were able to reunite her with her mother and siblings. When they watched her scream with joy as she ran to hug her family and saw the huge smile on her face, her adoptive parents knew they had done the right thing. They also knew it might mean that they would have to say goodbye to their daughter forever. But what happened next was what neither of them had ever expected. Through a translator, Esther's mother tearfully explained that she had never wanted her daughter to get sent away, and there had been a gaping hole in her heart ever since her daughter was torn away from her. She had many sleepless nights, wondering if Esther was alive, and if she was, what terrible things could be happening to her. She sobbed in relief as she learned that for the last few years, Esther had been living with kind people and had been given everything she could need or possibly want. Esther's mother explained that shortly after the little girl had been sold away against her will, that her husband had been killed by an enemy from a different local village. She had come together with other women and their children from the village, and together they were managing to create a safe, comfortable home for all their kids. It was by no means a life of luxury, but it was far better than the life they had been living before. When Henry and Ava learned the truth about Esther's family, they knew that keeping Esther in their home was no longer their decision to make. As much as they loved her, they knew that if she wanted to go back to her birth family, it would be wrong of them to stop her. So, with broken hearts, they joined together with Esther's birth mother to decide what should be done. While both Ava and Henry agreed to allow little Esther to go back home to her loving family, they were surprised to find out that this wasn't what Naomi, her birth mother, wanted. In between sobs, Naomi explained that as much as she would miss her oldest daughter, she wanted Esther to go back with Ava and Henry to the United States. She believed that she would have more opportunities and would ultimately live a happier life. Esther, who desperately loved her family and wanted to please them, agreed. She ended up moving in with Ava and Henry full-time, but was able to keep up with her family through a texting service her adoptive family had set up. The couple was even able to send money to Esther's family to make their lives easier. To this day, the couple has ensured that Naomi has all means to stay in touch with her eldest daughter, no matter what. Esther still lives in the United States, loving life and grateful for the kindness of her parents, Ava and Henry.